The moment Colette Beauregard walked through the revolving doors of the Meridian Grand Hotel in downtown Vancouver, she already knew the kind of look she was going to get. She'd seen it before. Too many times to count. She was 67 years old, wearing her late husband's oversized raincoat because it was the only thing warm enough for a February evening on the coast. And she was pulling a wheeled cart. The kind you see at farmers' markets, the collapsible ones with the plaid pattern. Loaded with 2 cloth bags and a small overnight case. Her gray hair was pinned up but coming loose on one side. Her boots were clean but old. She hadn't replaced them since 2019. None of that was who she was. But it was all anyone saw. The lobby of the Meridian Grand was the kind of place that made you feel underdressed just by existing in it. Marble floors. A chandelier that looked like it cost more than most people's annual salary. A front desk finished in dark walnut with gold hardware, staffed by 2 young people in matching charcoal blazers. Soft piano music floated from somewhere near the bar. Everything smelled like cedar and money. Colette crossed the lobby without hesitating. She'd learned a long time ago that hesitation was what they fed on. She approached the front desk. The young man on the left, his name tag read Theo, was already watching her with that particular expression. Not hostile, not exactly. It was more like a careful neutrality that was doing a lot of work to conceal something else. "Good evening," Colette said. "I have a reservation. Beauregard." Theo typed something, looked at the screen, typed again. "I'm sorry," he said, and his voice had that practiced hotel employee warmth that didn't actually reach his eyes. "I'm not seeing anything under that name." "Try Beauregard Lachance," Colette said. "My assistant may have booked it under the hyphenated name." Another pause, another few keystrokes. "Nothing under that either," Theo said. He folded his hands on the counter. "Do you perhaps have a confirmation number?" Colette opened her purse. It was a good purse. Italian leather, caramel-colored, bought in Rome 20 years ago, and maintained with the kind of care that made quality things last. Nobody noticed the purse. They were still looking at the raincoat. She found the printed email confirmation and placed it on the counter. Theo looked at it. He looked at her. He looked at it again. "Mrs. Beauregard," he said slowly, "this confirmation is for the presidential suite." "Yes," she said, "it is." The silence that followed was the specific kind of silence that happens when someone has made an assumption and the facts are refusing to cooperate with it. A door opened behind the front desk. A man stepped out, older than Theo, mid-40s, in a blazer with a slightly different cut that indicated rank. His name tag read Jill Fontaine, front office manager. Theo leaned slightly toward him and said something in a low voice. Jill looked at Colette. His expression was the kind you learn to put on when you've worked in hospitality long enough, smooth, unreadable, professionally pleasant. But something moved behind his eyes. A calculation. "Good evening, ma'am," Jill said, coming to stand beside Theo. "I understand there may be some confusion about your reservation." "There's no confusion on my end," Colette said pleasantly. "I made a reservation 6 weeks ago. The confirmation number is right there." "Of course." He glanced at the paper without picking it up. "The thing is, our presidential suite is currently undergoing some last-minute maintenance, a plumbing issue that came up this afternoon. I'm afraid we're going to need to relocate you." Colette looked at him steadily. "I see. And what room would you relocate me to?" "We have a very comfortable deluxe room on the 8th floor." "The presidential suite is on the 14th floor," Colette said. "And it's approximately $400 per night, more expensive than a deluxe room on the 8th floor. So, if there truly is a maintenance issue, I assume you'll be covering the difference and providing a written explanation?" Jill's blinked, just once. "I would need to check with our general manager about." "Could you do that now?" Colette asked. She smiled. It was the kind of smile she had developed over 40 years of boardrooms. It looked warm. It was not warm. "I'm happy to wait." Jill's excused himself. He disappeared behind a door, marked staff only. Theo stood at the front desk looking at somewhere in the middle distance, the way people do when they want very much, not to be involved in what is happening. Colette set her purse on the counter and looked around the lobby. A couple near the elevator was watching with the politely averted attention of people pretending not to watch. A bellhop near the luggage cart area was suddenly very focused on a piece of lint on his uniform. Gilles came back 2 minutes later. His expression had shifted slightly. Some of the professional smoothness had gone out of it, replaced by something that looked almost like discomfort. "Mrs. Beauregard," he said, "I've spoken with the general manager, and unfortunately the situation is the suite available or isn't it?" Colette asked. A beat. "I need to be transparent with you. There is no maintenance issue. The suite is available, but we have a policy of confirming certain reservations in person, given the nature of the accommodation." Colette looked at him. "A policy," she repeated. "Yes, a policy of confirming reservations for guests who look like they can afford the room they've booked." The lobby, which had not been loud to begin with, somehow became quieter. Gilles opened his mouth, closed it. "Because that's what just happened," Colette said. Her voice hadn't risen. It was very, very calm. "I walked in here, and you looked at my coat, and you decided I must have made some kind of mistake. So you told me there was a maintenance issue, and now that I've pushed back, suddenly, there isn't. I apologize if that's how it appeared. That's not how it appeared," she said. "That's what it was." She reached into her purse again. She placed a second card on the counter next to the confirmation email. It was a business card. Simple, white. The font was small. The logo in the corner was a small dark green stylized letter B. Gilles looked at it. His face changed, because anyone in the Vancouver hospitality industry knew what that small green B meant. Beauregard Hospitality Group. 11 hotels across British Columbia and Alberta. 4 restaurants. 2 boutique resorts. The kind of company that didn't need to advertise because it had been in business long enough that the name alone was sufficient. Colette had not inherited the company. She had built it. She had started with a single 14-room bed and breakfast in Tofino in 1987, the year her first husband left. The year her daughter was 3 years old, and asking questions Colette didn't have answers to yet. She had built it through years when she worked 16 hours a day and slept on a cot in the back office because she couldn't afford rent and a mortgage at the same time. She had built it through the years when banks told her no, and investors told her the market was saturated and people who looked like they were trying to help her actually wanted to watch her fail. She had built 11 hotels, and she knew every square foot of what it took to run one. Including exactly this. The Meridian Grand was not one of her properties, but the Meridian Grand's parent company had been in preliminary acquisition discussions with Beauregard Hospitality Group for 4 months. The meeting she was in Vancouver for, the meeting she had flown in early for, the reason she had a reservation at the Meridian Grand instead of one of her own hotels, was scheduled for tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. Gilles was still looking at the business card. He was not a bad man, Colette thought. She'd met bad men. She knew what they looked like. Gilles was something else. He was a man who had made a snap judgment and then committed to it, the way people do when they've told a small lie and have to keep telling it or it unravels. He'd looked at her coat and her cart and her loosely pinned hair, and he had done the mental math that so many people did, and the math had been wrong, and now he was standing with the answer to an equation that didn't add up anymore. His mouth opened, closed, opened again. What came out was, very quietly, "Mrs. Beauregard, I'm so deeply sorry." "I know you are," Colette said. "Now, you weren't before." She picked up the business card and put it back in her purse. She picked up the confirmation email and folded it once and put it in her coat pocket. She folded her hands on the counter. "Here is what I'd like," she said. "I'd like to check in to the room I reserved. I'd like a written apology from the hotel management to be delivered to my room by 8 o'clock this evening, and I'd like whatever your standard procedure is for incidents like this, and I hope you have one. To be followed." "Of course," Gilles said. His voice was smaller than it had been. "Of course. Absolutely." He began typing very quickly. Upstairs, in the suite which was in fact perfectly fine and showed no evidence of any maintenance issue whatsoever. Colette set her bags down by the window and stood looking out at the harbor. The lights were coming on across the water. The mountains to the north were turning the particular shade of blue-gray that she had always loved about this city. A float plane was making its way across the inlet, its lights blinking in the dusk. She had looked at this same view many times, from many rooms. She thought about the year she drove up to Tofino with $4,000, and a toddler in the back seat, and a business plan written on legal paper that her lawyer had told her was ambitious. She thought about the winter of 1994, when she almost lost everything. The bank calling in a loan, the roof of the B&B needing full replacement, a pipe that burst in December and flooded 3 rooms on the ground floor. She'd rebuilt it. She'd stood in the parking lot in rubber boots in 6 inches of water and called every contractor in the phone book until she found one who could start immediately. And she had been there every day until the rooms reopened. She thought about her daughter, Margot, who was now 39 and ran the northern properties. She thought about the moment Margot had called her 3 years ago and said, "Mom, we hit $100 million in annual revenue." And Colette had been sitting in her car outside a grocery store in Kelowna, eating a sandwich because she'd skipped lunch, and she'd said, "Good. Now let's think about what's next." People who saw her for the first time, with the old boots and the plaid cart and the raincoat that had been her husband Henri's, the good Henri, the second one, the one she'd had for 22 years before the cancer took him. Those people constructed a story about her. They always had. They probably always would. She had stopped being angry about it a long time ago. What she hadn't stopped doing was correcting the record. Not for herself. She was past needing validation from strangers in hotel lobbies. But for the next person who came through those doors wearing something that didn't match what was expected of them. For the woman behind her in line who might not have a business card to put on the counter. For the man who would hesitate in that lobby and turn around because he'd been made to feel like he didn't belong. She corrected the record for them. The written apology arrived at 7:45. It was signed by the general manager, a woman Colette had not met, whose name was Helen Marchetti, and it was better than Colette had expected. It was direct and specific and did not use passive voice or the phrase, "if you felt." It said, "We failed to provide you with the basic dignity that every guest deserves, regardless of appearance or presentation. This was wrong. We are taking corrective steps, including a review of front desk procedures and additional training." Colette read it twice. Then she sat down at the desk by the window and wrote a response by hand on the hotel's stationery. "Dear Miss Marchetti, thank you for your letter. I will say this plainly. The apology is accepted. Not because the incident was small, but because the response was genuine. That matters. I have been in this industry for 40 years. What happened tonight happens every day, in lobbies like this one, to people who don't have a business card to put on the counter. Please don't forget that. Train your staff not just to avoid the mistake I experienced, but to ask themselves why they almost make it. I look forward to our meeting tomorrow. Colette Beauregard." She sealed it in one of the hotel's envelopes and called down to the front desk. A different voice answered, quieter, more careful. "Could you ensure this is delivered to your general manager tonight?" Colette asked. "Yes, of course, Mrs. Beauregard. Absolutely." "Thank you," she said. "Have a good evening." She hung up the phone, stood, walked to the window again. The float plane was long gone. The harbor was dark and bright at the same time, the way water is at night in a city. All that reflected light, moving. She thought about the acquisition meeting, about the questions she'd prepared, about the numbers she'd reviewed on the flight down from Kelowna, about the fact that she was 67 years old and had been told, at various points in her life, that she was too young, too inexperienced, too old, too set in her ways, too ambitious, not ambitious enough, and, in one memorable meeting in 1999, that she didn't present the profile that a particular investor was looking for in a CEO. She hadn't thought about that investor in years. She thought about him now, briefly. She hoped he was well. She turned from the window and began unpacking her overnight case, because tomorrow was a workday, and she had always believed in being ready. The meeting the next morning was in a conference room on the hotel's mezzanine level. When Colette arrived, punctually in a dark blazer she'd had made in Montreal, with her hair properly pinned, the Meridian Grand's corporate team was already there. Helen Marchetti was among them. She was a woman in her 50s, sharp-eyed, with the particular posture of someone who had also spent decades in rooms where people underestimated her. When Colette walked in, Helen stood up immediately. "Not the way you stand up for a business meeting. The way you stand up when you mean it." "Mrs. Beauregard," she said. "I'm Helen. I want to say in person, last night was unacceptable, and I'm sorry." "You already said that in writing," Colette replied. "So let's start fresh." She looked around the table. "Shall we?" They sat. The meeting was 2 hours long. Colette asked the questions she'd prepared and several she hadn't. She listened carefully. She took notes by hand in a small leather notebook, the same way she had taken notes in every meeting for 40 years. At the end, one of the men on the Meridian side, a younger executive, 20s, clearly the kind of person who had been told he was very smart for most of his life, said something that was meant to be a compliment. "I have to say, Mrs. Beauregard, you're not what I expected." The room went slightly still. Colette looked at him. She looked at him the way you look at someone when you are deciding whether to spend energy on them or not. She decided this time to spend a little. "What did you expect?" she asked. He stumbled. "I just meant someone with a company the size of—" "You expected someone who looked the part," Colette said. Not unkindly. Simply. "And I didn't. And now I do, because you know what I've built, and that's the only thing that changed." She closed her notebook. "Think about that the next time you form an opinion about someone before they've had a chance to show you who they are." The room was very quiet. Helen Marchetti, across the table, was looking at Colette with an expression that was very close to something like respect. The young executive nodded slowly. He looked like a person who had just learned something and wasn't entirely comfortable with it yet. Good, Colette thought. Discomfort was where learning happened. The acquisition did not close that week. These things take time. Lawyers, due diligence, negotiations that stretch over months. But the conversation started well. The foundation was there. On her way out of the hotel, Colette stopped at the front desk. Theo was there again. He saw her coming, and his whole body made the involuntary adjustment of a person bracing for a consequence. She stopped in front of him. "I'm checking out," she said. "And I want to tell you something before I go." He waited. "Yesterday evening you made a decision about who I was before I opened my mouth. You decided I probably didn't belong here based on what I was wearing. I know you know that's what happened." He said nothing. His expression had gone careful and tight. "I'm not going to tell you you're a bad person," Colette said. "I don't think you are. I think you're a young person who has been trained, by the culture, by this industry, by 100 small messages, to sort people by appearance and make decisions accordingly. And I think you probably didn't even fully realize you were doing it." She paused. "But you were." "I know," he said quietly. "I'm sorry." "Thank you," she said. "I mean that. Now use it. Every person who walks through that door, Theo, every single one, deserves to be treated like they might be exactly who they are, because they are." She picked up her cart. "Take care of yourself." She walked across the marble lobby. The chandelier threw light across the floor in long, refracted patterns. The piano music was playing again, something soft and minor key, the notes following her toward the door. She walked through the revolving glass and out into the February morning. The mountains were still there. They always were, cold and clear and indifferent in the best possible way, the way that reminds you that the world is large, and most of what happens in lobbies doesn't really matter in the long run. She breathed in the cold air, pulled her husband's raincoat tighter around her. Started walking. "I think about Colette Beauregard sometimes. Not just because of what she built, but because of how she moved through that lobby. Quietly, without performing outrage, without needing the room to understand her before she understood herself. That's a kind of freedom most people spend their whole lives working toward. Here's what I want you to carry with you from this. You never know who you're looking at. Not really. The person in the worn raincoat might be the one who signs the papers. The person pulling a plaid cart might have built something that outlasts every assumption you've ever made about them. But here's the harder truth, the one that matters more, I think. Even if Colette hadn't owned 11 hotels, even if she were exactly what Gilles assumed she was, a woman of modest means, traveling on a budget, who had somehow saved for a nice room for one night, she would have deserved the same check-in, the same respect, the same level of basic human dignity, not because of what she'd built, because of who she was. That's the thing we keep getting backwards, isn't it? We extend grace to people once we find out they're important. But grace isn't supposed to come after the reveal. It's supposed to come before we even ask the question. If this story made you think of someone who was underestimated, written off, judged by what they wore or how they looked or how they walked into a room, I hope you'll share it with them. And I hope, the next time you're in a lobby of any kind, you'll remember Colette in her husband's raincoat, standing very still, waiting to be seen.